So I start from the position of someone who is here with both a professional and a personal hat on. And this for me is really, really important. I try to draw on both my personal and my professional experience everywhere that I go. And today I'm standing in front of you as someone who might be the kind of person that you've given up on in the past. I am that statistic that when we talk about zero suicide and that aim, we think, sometimes there are some patients and we think, but in that case, I don't think there's anything we could have done. It felt inevitable. I was that patient who, it felt that there was no way forward. I was just too ill, too broken. It was too difficult. And life has been really quite hard at various different points. But I've been really, really lucky, and people haven't given up on me. And for me, that has largely been about building connections. And so what I really want to think about this morning is about the power of human connection. Because today we're all thinking about digital and tech, and sometimes we think maybe that's going to create barriers between us and those that we care for. And actually, I want you to invite you to kind of turn that on its head and think about how actually can we, in fact, strengthen those connections, build better, more human connections using technology to aid rather than to hinder that. So I'm going to start with this question. I want you first to think about, does your patient, does your client, does the person in your care know that you care? Are you always confident when sat in a room with someone or when engaging with someone across technology that they actually know why you're there in the room? And it feels really obvious to us. Of course, we're in caring professions. We're here purely because we care. But remember, your patient doesn't always know that. And when I draw on my own personal experience and I think about the hardest, most difficult times, there were times when I found myself sat in a room with someone whose job it was to care, and I felt that was the only reason that they were there. So how can we enable our patients, our clients, those that we care for, to know that we actually give a damn about them? How can we bridge that gap and enable them to know, I actually do care? I just want you to have a think with the person next to you. How can you do that? How can you cross that gap? You can talk. Danger, Pooky, don't invite them to talk when they've just got here, they'll never stop. So this will be a theme of this brief talk, will be me stopping you just as you're getting going, but that's what today's about, is about building those connections, so do continue these conversations later on. So how can you let your patient know that you care? This really matters because actually, when we're at our most vulnerable, we feel like it's not possible that anyone could care. We feel unlovable, and that, why would you care? How could you care? How could you possibly give a damn about me? And actually enabling our patients, our clients, the people we care for, to realize that we do care and that they are worth caring for, I think is a really, really important first step in building that connection, letting them know that for us, this is more than just a job, because it really is, isn't it? Letting them know that we care. And what we often find is that for those of us who are distressed or who've experienced trauma or for whom things feel really difficult right now, that what tends to happen is that people perhaps might start to want to listen, might start to invite us to open up, but when we begin to really kind of dig deep and be brave about this stuff, that people tend to disappear, that people become either physically or emotionally distant from us. So my challenge to you and how you can make a difference here is that, can you be that person who runs towards rather than away from distress? This is something that matters particularly when you're working with individuals who've experienced trauma, when you're working with individuals who perhaps you might be the first person with whom they're sharing a really, really difficult truth, whether that's about something that's actually happened to them or it's about a perception of self. This is really, really tough for them. And when we stay physically and emotionally present and we're prepared to run towards rather than away, that's when we can really build those connections and make a difference. My next question for you in terms of building human connections is when you have someone in front of you or you're connecting with them via technology, how much do you really know about them, and the different fears and thoughts that they're bringing into the room? We can sometimes, because we're very busy, end up in a situation where our patients, our clients, become just another one, and we think that we know about them, but actually sometimes that's a story that hasn't been fully told yet, and we don't know all the different things that they're bringing into the room today. And there are all sorts of different fears that everybody that you work with will have to have overcome to have been in the room with you today. Do you really know what those things are? And sometimes we'll think, well, the things that scare them might be the big things. If we're working with someone with an eating disorder, we go instantly to food. If we're working with someone who've experienced trauma, then we're going instantly to the abuse or the other difficulties that they've experienced. But sometimes it's the small things. Sometimes it's physically being in the room with you that scares them, and you're not scary, I'm sure, but to them you might be. You might be the representation of the first time that they've opened up about something difficult. Maybe there's something that they've left behind at home this morning that scares them. Maybe the journey scares them. I have an absolutely paralyzing fear of trains, so I'm one of the few people who will have driven here today. But for me, that really mattered, and it stopped me engaging in therapy. I would arrive at therapy completely broken from the journey because I was so terrified of getting there. And it was only when my therapist stopped and understood that the thing that really scared me wasn't so much about the stuff he wanted to uncover in the room. It was about physically getting to the room. And it was only then, when he really took time to understand and address that head on and give me some different practical solutions about how else I might get there, that we were able to begin to dig deep. And that's kind of a small example, but it's different for everyone that we work with. And I guess that the important thing here is just to ask ourselves that question: do I know what scares the other person in the room? And do I create an environment that is safe and conducive to them feeling that they can tell me those things that scare them, no matter how small and seemingly silly? Imagine how ridiculous I felt. You know, I have a PhD and very professional, all the rest of it, but I'm scared of trains. I felt like an idiot. But my therapist created an environment where I was able to talk about that openly and honestly, and you can create that environment too. The other thing is that sometimes when we invite people to share with us the things that scare them, sometimes they are big things, sometimes they are really difficult things, and often they're things that we can't do something about. You're not always going to be able to say, well, use the car instead of the train, we fixed that one. You're not going to be able to change everything. And sometimes the biggest thing that we can make a difference by doing is by recognizing, I can't fix this, I can't change this for you right now, but what I can do is walk alongside you whilst we face it together, so that your patient, your client, the person that you're working with no longer feels quite so alone. And sometimes that's the best that we can offer, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. The third thing I invite you to think about is, how can you find what is good in your patient? How can you flip the narrative? And instead of seeing this person in front of you through the lens of weakness and challenge, through the various different diagnoses and labels that have been applied to them, how instead can you see them in terms of their protective factors, in terms of the things that are good here? Everybody has something. It might be that there's someone that they really care about, or that really cares about them. Maybe they've got a hobby, a passion, an interest, a skill, something that they're happy to begin to talk about. Maybe there's a different way that you can define this person in front of you. This was kind of really well kind of summarized for me in two different approaches from two different psychiatrists that I interacted with over the years as a patient. The first one, having had a diagnostic conversation with me at some length, wrote me a letter which broke my heart, and that letter started, Pooky has no hobbies or interests. And it then went on, and I can't tell you what else it said in that letter, because that first sentence sent me into a completely sort of suicidal tailspin, because I suddenly was nothing. I was nothing to this man that I'd met with for 2 hours and talked with at length, and I couldn't hear the rest. Conversely, more recently, I've had a much more positive experience with a wonderful psychiatrist who has really, really cared for me. And she engaged with me as a person and really encouraged me as I began to enjoy hobbies and interests for the first time perhaps, and I had begun to develop a love of climbing, and in her discharge letter recently she started with this as a strength. In the time that I've been working with Pooky and she's been recovering from anorexia, she's developed a really keen interest in climbing, and she talked at length about how she felt this was a really good protective factor, and something she would encourage me to continue to engage in. And I knew here was someone who got me, here was someone who saw me as a person and saw me for my strengths, not my weaknesses. I arrived in her clinician's room, someone who was entirely broken, someone who was literally unable to walk because my illness had made me so weak, someone who was not able to engage with friends or family, who'd not been at work for quite a while because I was so unwell, and who was really unable to engage in anything because I was having so many very, very severe flashbacks all the time that life was just too hard. But I left her room someone who was able to climb and who'd also, developed other hobbies along the way too. I now sing and I enjoy lots of stuff with my children, and there's lots of good stuff going on. And I know that her, the second psychiatrist, is the person who would look for what is good here. And there's lots of different ways that we can find that, but again, it's about enabling someone to tell their story. So I want you to have a think, just for 30 seconds or so. How can you find what's good here when you are presented with someone for whom it seems that there are only negatives and labels? How can you find what might be the good thing that you can hang your conversations on with them? 30 seconds. You may talk. Okay. So I invite you to see your patients, your clients as people. I encourage you to build that human connection. That is often the thing that will save and change lives more than, the many years of training that we have. Sometimes it's that ability to make a connection that can really make a difference. And I leave you with this final thought. This is one of my favorite images. This is Banksy, and it's all about hope. And actually, is the girl letting go of the balloon? Is it leaving her, or is she about to grab it and take hold of it? And just remember, you can be the little girl. And for the person in the room with you, depending on, your ability to connect and hold on to hope with them, for them, you can make the difference between whether the balloon is floating away or whether we're about to grab hold of it and move forwards together. Thank you for listening, and I really look forward to the rest of the day.